Another driver game. I remember back in the day before this game was released that I was excited for this mainly because Reflections wanted to go back to its roots. And from what I had seen, they would get rid of the walking and shooting around that were present in Driver 2, well, somewhat, Driver 3, 76 and Parallel Lines, but instead go back to the original Driver idea where it was just you and the car. So yes, I loved the concept of the original Driver that much back then, and still do now. So I bought the game early on, even in the collector's edition with this amazing car, and started playing. But sadly the game still missed the mark. Replaying and beating the whole thing again for this video almost 10 years later, especially after having played and beat all other Driver games, well, almost, then I am a bit more critical towards San Francisco today than I have ever been in the past. I understand what Reflections and Ubisoft tried to do here, and in many ways they succeeded. So no, I am not saying that San Francisco is a bad game by any means. Heck, it's actually an amazing one, certainly better than Parallel Lines, and even that one was not really that bad. However, it still wasn't what I was hoping for, and I would say that the Driver franchise did not die after San Francisco. It died after Driver 3. Oh yeah, this might be a very controversial thing to say from my part, especially seeing how people tend to prefer this game over any other Driver game, and hey, it's fine if you disagree, but for me, once the publisher changed, so did the franchise. Well, even before that. You can say that Driver 3 failed because of Atari, and yes, I agree. Atari was the major cause for the DriverGate, and later they even sold Driver to Ubisoft. And while Ubisoft kept the franchise alive, which I am thankful for regardless, it didn't keep it alive in the same way even after Martin Edmondson's return to San Francisco. But let's go step by step here. Nathan Drake now is the Driver. Oh wait, let me try that again. John Tanner is back, which was quite a surprise after Parallel Lines and after what happened in the end of Driver 3. So yes, he survived, and so did Jack Nicholson. I mean, Jericho. In fact, this game takes place just 6 months after the events of Driver 3. Jericho is about to get sentenced, and Tanner wants to make sure to witness it. But Tobias Jones somewhat talks him out of it, until this happens. So the chase is on once again, but this time Tanner gets involved in a major car accident that puts him in the hospital. But he is still able to drive around as always, as if nothing happened. The first time I've played Driver San Francisco, I thought that a lot of time had passed between the accident and him being driving around in San Francisco again, but actually no. In fact, Tanner still is in the hospital and remains there until towards the end of the game, and all he is experiencing is in his mind. So yeah, it's all a dream, and to be honest, I always thought that it was a lazy way to tell a story. So technically, being in a dream, Tanner can do whatever he wants, and that he does. He finds out that he can use some sort of superpower where he can shift to any car he wants by taking over the body of the driver. And sometimes that leads to quite amusing interactions if that car had a passenger in it. Tanner has a real grasp of San Francisco to where he can reimagine or dream or whatever the whole city to its detail in his dream state. Even back then, that point always seemed a bit weird to me. How can he dream to this level of detail? But hey, I can't even describe the city I've been living in for almost 30 years to its detail while I am conscious, so yeah, who am I to judge? the story progresses mainly based on what he's hearing on the TV. While in reality he's unconscious in the hospital bed, the events that he goes through in his dream are based on what the TV newscaster is reporting. With that, he uses the state he is in to find out what Jericho is doing and to stop him, who can also shift for some reason. Even today I don't really get how Jericho can even use the shift ability at all. Did he also suffer from the accident from the beginning of the game, and was he also unconscious during the same time Tanner was? Or can he shift while conscious? Or maybe Tanner was just imagining Jericho having the same kind of power? Maybe I've missed something crucial here, I don't know. But at some point, Tanner wakes up and starts pursuing Jericho, and it all leads to both of them going head to head, until Jones stops the party. As stated, I think it's kind of a lazy way to make everything a dream because it lowers any real stakes the story otherwise would have, and it makes what the characters go through rather a non-issue in a way. Maybe it would have been better if the whole game were a dream from beginning to end and the ending of Driver 3 were the actual end of Tanner and Jericho as well. Or at least put both in a hospital for good. But especially when looking at the character design, I don't really get it. I mean, Tobias Jones looks fine, and it's not a major difference from what he looked like when Driver 2 and Driver 3 happened. Well, mainly just different hair length, I guess. However, Jericho's design is a bit off. I don't fully buy that these are the same characters. But still, I can accept Jericho's new look more than John Tanner. Tanner looks like a slightly older Nathan Drake instead of, well, John Tanner. I would probably buy his looks and even personality if the game took place during his rookie period as a police officer or something, but in fact San Francisco, once again, takes place 6 months after Driver 3. It's damn weird seeing him look younger for whatever reason. And yeah, his personality doesn't really match either. Previously, Tanner was more of a serious guy that did not take shit from anybody and did not even talk all that much. But this new Tanner talks a lot more, loves to be sarcastic. For the most part, he is less violent by nature. Well, yeah, don't mind him crashing around. I assume he does this because he knows it's a dream. And cracks a lot of jokes for some reason. I mean, you may make the argument that since Jericho is now going to be sentenced, Tanner now has a chance to relax and be himself, but even then I don't buy it. And yes, while outside his dream state he tends to be a bit more serious, he still isn't that Tanner we all knew from Driver 1, 2 and 3. Back to the dream though. On the other hand, the way Reflections handled it was still kind of smart because they are telling you from the very start of the game to not take anything too seriously and, well, just have fun. When you were a kid and played with toy cars, then maybe you loved to crash them into one another, right? Playing in these illustrated carpets with roads, houses and whatever, you know. At least I remember doing that when I was a little shit. And if you look at San Francisco as something like going back to your childhood where you played with cars in those carpets, then what was presented here was actually quite amazing. Because it's a lot of fun to look at the city from the top, to shift, drive whatever at any point in time and crashing around. I know it's not a gimmick because the game was built around this shift system. It feels like you are a little kid again in a way. I don't know if these were the intentions of the developers, but it seems like it. And yes, I like the system. even though it has its negatives, which I will address later. You can actually tell that the game was casualfied in some way just by considering the driving physics. The more realistic driving physics from earlier games are gone and replaced with more arcade-like ones similar to Parallel Lines or even 76. I mean, there still is a certain level of original driver DNA in San Francisco with how some cars handle and feel, but at the same time you can tell that it is nowhere near the same. Driving doesn't require you to fight against the car to stay on the road, for example, or seeing the suspension bounce around doesn't have the same effect. I mean, in a way I get it, since for the most part you will drive more modern cars which have better handling than the classic ones. Well, obviously, but there is something that doesn't feel right about the physics, especially when you associate it with the Driver franchise. Most, if not all, cars feel too loose, as if they didn't have enough weight in them, like an arcade-style game. It's also like the game emphasizes drifting and high speeds more than anything else, as if it were a Need for Speed, Burnout or Test Drive game. Especially weird is when you press the normal brakes and turn at higher speeds, or at least try to turn, but the cars refuse to do it, and instead you crash. You are forced, for the most part, to use the e-brakes instead. There is something really weird about it, on how the cars handle, that doesn't feel right, even compared to Parallel Lines. I mean, the game still has a good sense of speed, and driving around the city with any vehicle is a lot of fun. There are no bikes or boats, but that's absolutely fine. Heck, you can't walk around either, and that's also beyond fine. Especially when considering Driver 3 and its horrendous on-foot controls. You have over 100 vehicles you can drive around with, and yes, most vehicles feel different from one another, but all of them still feel really arcade-like. And actually, the amount of vehicles the game has and how they handle points to the overall problem this game has that I will tackle towards the end. So you have the city of San Francisco, and I assume that it has quite a few landmarks in it. Maybe it was even completely remodeled after the real city, I don't know. Despite all of that, the city as a whole is fairly big and fun to drive around. In the beginning though, it isn't as big because you have to unlock parts of the city as you progress through the story, but when everything is unlocked, then driving around and exploring is quite fun. Since Tanner is essentially dreaming, he can look from above the city. Again, it's as if you are a kid playing around in those illustrated carpets. On that aspect, I can only praise the developers. As you can also see on the map, there are yellow and blue icons. The yellow ones are the main story, while the blue ones are optional. But throughout the main story, it seems like there are side quests that you necessarily have to beat for actually no reason. For example, why does Tanner need to go through this storyline of these two Japanese students? Or this guy wanting to shoot some car stunts for some movie he's making or something? What purpose does this serve? I wouldn't have a problem with it if they were optional, but they actually aren't. You have to do these, or at least some of these at first, because the main story events with Tanner and Jones, which is marked with a big T, is blocked when it never should have been in the first place. Look, I know that the game would probably be only 3 or 4 hours long if Reflections did not include these mandatory subplots as main events, because ultimately the main story with Tanner and Jones and Jericho is really short. Too short even. But an obvious way to move around this problem would have been to make the story longer. How? Well, actually quite simple. instead of those subplots with those Japanese kids, replace those subplots with real subplots that involve Tanner, Jones and Jericho instead of some irrelevant Japanese students or a movie crew. I mean, Tanner is already dreaming, right? So to find Jericho, he would need to remember and replay some events from past driver games or something to get some clues where Jericho is. Or maybe somehow Jones starts to use the shift ability as well to help Tanner out. Or maybe even you play the game from Jericho's point of view at parts. Anything would have been better than these events that you need to clear to progress but have nothing to do with the actual story. The blue icons are divided in two. Let's call the big icons events and the small icons performance. The blue event icons are based on the main yellow icons. For example, once you've won the race with the Japanese kids, you will unlock racing events. The blue performance icons are just simple stuff like jumping for a certain amount of length, or drift for a certain amount of length, or some kind of other stunt there. Doing these blue icons, or even simply drifting near missing other cars or whatever, while you are just cruising around, will give you WP, which essentially is like a currency in the game. You will need these if you want to buy cars or even buy upgrades like the Thrill Cam. With this Thrill Cam, it's as if you were the cameraman instead of the driver, but you still are the one controlling the car, so pay attention to that. Or buy a longer boost or something. Adding to these icons, you can also unlock challenges in your garages. Yes, you can buy garages throughout the city that unlock new cars and then buy them. But many cars are only unlockable if you do events. The challenges themselves are mostly unlockable if you collect these movie icons that you can find throughout the city. And they are called movie icons for a reason, because these challenges are actually based on various real movie scenes. Some of those movies were even the inspiration for the birth of the Driver franchise. You may also notice that these challenges don't allow you to use your shift power or even boost. So these events are just you and the car, quite literally like the original Driver. On top of this, look at this film grain, I guess it's called, these challenges use. Reflections continue to show that they love the chase movies of old, like I do, even if San Francisco as a whole doesn't quite capture what the first Driver games did. Heck, Reflections even had the balls to go back and give players what many criticized in the first game. You know what it is? Oh yeah! It's the very first mission in the garage. I literally loved this mission in the very first game, but the physics in San Francisco somehow don't feel right for a mission like this. Sound effects and music are quite good, and while graphically the game looks quite fine, everything looks a bit generic in a way. Outside of the cars and their interiors, they look quite good. Especially the sky in Driver 3 looks more impressive and has more color and style than San Francisco's sky. And by the way, how come there is no day to night cycle? Instead you just drive during the day and that's about it. So let me get this straight then. He can dream about the whole city of San Francisco to its detail, but he cannot dream driving at night? Does it have to do with the fact that he got into the accident during the day? Is that it? He can dream driving on tarmac and dirt, but cannot dream driving in the rain? He can dream about car crashes, where the models don't look as detailed as Driver 3 for example, and he can dream about all these subplots and events but cannot dream of a harder difficulty? Because the game is too easy. The game is even easier when you consider that for the most part you can just shift around. I mean, you don't have to do that, you can beat the game without it, well, almost, but even then the game is easy. It's not as easy as Driver 76, but it's rather on the level of parallel lines, which is, well, quite sad. At least give us a higher difficulty here. From my point of view, the game could have been as difficult as Driver 1 or even Driver 2, but if Reflections feared backlash from players because the game would be maybe too difficult to beat, I guess, then make it at least as difficult as Driver 3. But no, they made it a cakewalk instead. I mean, sure, the AI gets a bit smarter the further you progress, but even then, it's almost a joke. There is also police, and it actually makes sense that they will not chase after you. Well, for the most part. But it's still a bit disappointing that they barely react to you unless you crash onto them, and they aren't as harsh as in previous games, which leads to a lack of police chases, quite obviously. That's also something I should have mentioned in Driver 3 as well, though, because the lack of police chases in the main story were a bit disappointing as well, but if you know what happened during the development of that one, then I will give Reflections the benefit of the doubt here. However, San Francisco is a different story. But yeah, there are missions where you play as the police and you can shift to their cars to try to catch criminals. The UI looks a bit more basic and lacks a bit personality. Especially confusing was the map, because I was used to it being on the bottom right, but in San Francisco it's on the top center. There is also a ram system, I guess, where you can ram cars and do some serious damage. I mean, it's kind of fun, but it didn't interest me all that much, just like the online multiplayer. Yeah, I've played it for a bit back in the day and remember it being fine, but today I really don't give a shit about it. Okay, look, just like Parallel Lines, San Francisco isn't a bad game by any means. In fact, it's a better game than Parallel Lines, and yes, I had a lot more fun with San Francisco. And yes, I kind of also had fun with Parallel Lines, but still more fun with San Francisco. However, while Parallel Lines seemed like a typical GTA clone at the time, San Francisco seems like it doesn't even try to be a proper driver game either, but instead it tries to be something else, not quite GTA though, that pays homage to the Driver franchise. You see, all these things I've mentioned, like the low difficulty, the amount of icons, collectibles and events, the very short story, the amount of vehicles that you can buy or unlock, all these systems that were put in place throw away the focus and pure element the franchise once had. That pure element being just you and the car. Basically having a single system and make it the best it can be. That's why games like the original Driver, the first Stuntman or Tenchu, in my eyes, are timeless classics, because they had a simple idea and made it the best it could be for the time. You know the saying, jack of all trades but master of none? Sure, that line doesn't fully fit San Francisco as well as it fits Parallel Lines, but honestly, this game isn't that far away from being that. Sure, San Francisco has more reason to be labeled a driver game than Parallel Lines or 76, but still it should have been its own IP instead. Despite all of it, the game still did well, and I understand why. The reviews were quite positive back in the day and the game has good and fun elements to it. However, supposedly it didn't do all that well, or at least not well enough for Ubisoft. And considering that as a whole, driving and racing games at the time were not doing all that well, that may also be why we haven't seen another main driver game after 2011, and I suspect that we will never see it again. Which is actually fine by me. I prefer a franchise to rest for good than being milked and butchered to oblivion.